On February 17, 2021, a paper published by Sahar and Salim of Cairo University's Faculty of Medicine and Zahi Hawass, the former Minister of Antiquities, revealed results of a CT scan on Seqenenre Tao's battle-ravaged mummy. The findings paint a visceral picture of devoted defiance in the face of overwhelming violence and brutality. Sometime just before 1874, an Egyptian tomb robber named Abd al-Rasul was walking the cliffs of Deir al-Bahri near Hatshepsut's famous temple on the front side of the Valley of the Kings, when one of his goats struggled and collapsed through the sand, tumbling down a shaft. Abd, who had made a living robbing nearby tombs with his brother, quickly followed and was met with a sight that must have both awed him and terrified him. Wadjet and Nekbet, the cobra and the vulture, icons of royalty and divinity in ancient Egypt, and protectors of the two lands. Royal burials. As items began appearing on the antiquities market, authorities were quick to close in on the two brothers as their source. After what must have been an unpleasant interrogation, the Egyptian Service of Antiquities was led to a tomb originally used to inter a high priest of Amun in the reign of Ramses XI, named Pinegem. Egypt during this period was on the brink of a severe decline. Tomb robbing had become a plague, and this high priest was tasked by his king to inspect royal and noble tombs. He discovered, to his horror, that nearly all had been ransacked and robbed. In an effort to preserve their remains and in his mind the smooth functioning of the universe itself, he moved them to the site of his future tomb. Over 50 royal mummies, including Seqenenre Tao, Ahmose, Amenhotep I, Thutmose I to the fourth, Ramses I, Seti I, Ramses II, III, and IX. Some of the most significant kings of the New Kingdom, indeed some of them critical to its establishment. The 15th, 16th, and 17th dynasties weren't sequential. They existed simultaneously as an invading force from the Levant took control of Lower Egypt, pushing native Egyptian authority far to the south. In the reign of Seqenenre Tao, a multi-generational war erupted, ultimately resulting in the expulsion of the Hyksos and the re-establishment of Egyptian rule over the two lands of Upper and Lower Egypt. Of the many royal remains discovered in the Deir al-Bahri mummy cache, one was the architect of this revolt, an Egyptian king with horrible wounds, a warrior who led his people and sacrificed his life, Seqenenre Tao. Of the February 17, 2021 paper, here's what we know. A fatal wound on the upper region of the frontal bone suggests that the assailant was, quote, in a raised position, riding a horse, or by the king being in a lowered position, either sitting down or kneeling, unquote. The Hyksos had horses. Indeed, they introduced them to Egypt, but they didn't mount them. They used them as chariots to move infantry and to encircle enemy with archers. The suggestion that this wound resulted from battle would mandate a total collapse of Egyptian forces in a general melee, which is extremely unlikely. 7 additional wounds show that he was hit by assailants from his left, from his right, and his front. He was surrounded. Significantly, other wounds fill in the story. His shoulders were dislocated, and his arms were bent at the elbow. Deformities in his hands and wrists, absent of defensive injuries, suggest they were bound. Seqenenre's mummified hands are flexed at the wrists, and the fingers are spastic. This arm position is not consistent with the usual cross-pectoral position of the royal ancient Egyptian mummies. His hand position suggests that the king's wrists were tied together, likely behind his body when he died. If the king died while his hands were bound, The muscles that were in intense contraction just before death would have become rigid immediately after death, unable to relax. This condition is known as cadaveric spasm. It typically affects the hands and limbs of individuals who are subjected to violent deaths and whose nervous systems were disturbed at the moment of death. Example, a drowning victim's hand clenching on weeds from the waterbed. He wasn't just surrounded. He wasn't killed in the midst of fighting. He was captured, bound, and executed. But he was first beaten. Three-dimensional CT image of the head of Seqenenre in frontal projection showing multiple craniofacial injuries, a gaping fracture of the frontal bone, fracture of the right eyebrow. Blunt trauma caused comminuted fractures of the nose, right orbit, and right zygoma, and a small perforating wound overlying the right cheek caused by fragments of the fractured zygoma. Finally, a right parietal fracture while the king was lying down on his left side. The CT results of the skull gruesomely show that he had remained in this position on his left side for some time, long enough for decomposition to begin, which saw his brain pool on the left side of his skull. One can only imagine the sense of urgency and fueling of ferocity this generated amongst the Egyptians. Their divine king, captured and bound in submission, executed by a horde of foreign assailants, and left to rot on the field of battle. While his death was violent, the recovery of his remains seems to be tender. The quality of his wrappings and mummification suggest he was taken to a royal workshop. There, embalmers did their best to beautify their king, hiding as many of the wounds as possible under wrappings. Seqenenre Tao's death undoubtedly inspired his people to fight. His sons Kamos and Amos launched a campaign of total war, resulting in the death of Kamos. Amos conclusively defeated the Hyksos, avenging his brother and father, and founded a dynasty that would see some of Egypt's greatest kings like the Amenhoteps, Thutmoses I to IV, Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, and Tutankhamun. Seqenenre, whose name means the one whom Ra has made brave, lived up to his name. Of the many wounds received, none were from behind. He faced his attackers defiant and inspired a civilization.